Good afternoon. If I can have your attention, please. I know you haven't come to hear from me, and that's okay. Great. Before we start, how are you enjoying the conference? Once again, to the team at Global Washington that puts together the conference, I would love to appreciate them. So, and Kristen and our friends who have actually worked on the program, I'd like to acknowledge the work that they have done in putting together, again, another stellar program for us. So thank you very much. And of course, we would not be able to put such an event together without our sponsors, supporters, all of you that actually show up. So my deepest gratitude to all of you for continuing to support us and to come out every year. How many of you have been for all 11 conferences? Hey, you got a lot of catching up to do. All right. 20 years ago, a group of graduate students at the Kennedy School at Harvard probably didn't like the way the aid agency was going about its business. People had money, they wanted to give money away. Governments wanted to help other countries, and things were just going along happily. And then this group of people decided that, that's not the right way to do things. So they launched an organization called DevX. DevX became and is now the largest media platform for all of us that work in the development sector, the humanitarian sector, the education sector, the healthcare sector, the agriculture sector, the environment, climate change. Raj Kumar, who's our featured speaker and author of his fantastic book, created, along with his colleagues, DevX, to really re-examine how each one of us that were in this sector connected to each other and how we were, in a collaborative way, able to amplify the work that we all do. His book is about his journey, his experience, his ability to have seats as some of the largest gatherings in the world, and their ability to influence change in those settings, and to bring to the forefront the conversation of development, the conversation of social justice, the conversations around equity to the forefront. So please join me in welcoming Raj Kumar.
Thank you so much, Akhtar. Akhtar was just telling me before I came up that this is kind of like a family gathering, and I feel that. I feel like I'm part of that family. It's fantastic to be with all of you today. It's my first time. I know there's some People have been here 11 years. It's my first time at this fantastic conference. It's really an honor to get to be here today. You know, when I got started at DevX, and I tell this story in the book, I wanted to get a job in global development. You know, I was like a lot of graduate students. I wanted to have a career in this field. I wanted to have a career with purpose, and I really didn't know how to do it. And so I asked around to my colleagues and professors, and they all said, go down to Washington, D.C., and go to cocktail parties. And I was kind of shocked. I thought, this is a mission-driven industry, and this is how it works? It just comes down to networking? Well, had I known back then, and had there been a Global Washington, I would have just flown out here to get my job. And I'm sure there's some people in the room with that intention. But this sector, this industry really was, 19, 20 years ago, organized in ways that were pretty inefficient. And we set out, a few students and myself set out, as Akhtar said, to see if we could do something about that. Our basic idea was if we looked at other industries, we found that people could get objective journalism or insightful analysis or just basic data and information about who's doing what, and they could get it online. This was the year 2000. And we thought, well, the development industry, just like all these other industries, is going to be totally disrupted. And it's going to be disrupted like telephones and internet are disrupting their sectors, and like the newspaper industry and like the automotive industry, like the energy sector. We thought that was coming in 2000, and the fact is we were totally wrong. And so our little idea, DevX, stayed a pretty little idea for a long time. We were 8 of us working out of a 2-bedroom apartment. 4 of us were sleeping there in Washington, D.C. We were there for a long time. And it took years before the broader aid industry started to say, well, maybe we do need an objective source of data and information. Maybe we do care about what's happening in other parts of the development and aid sector beyond where I work or the institution where I happen to be sitting. And you know, having witnessed this for 19 years now since we got started, what I realized after the last couple of years is it's actually, this is the moment. We were wrong about the year 2000, but this is the moment that our industry, that our purpose-driven, mission-driven industry around development and humanitarian aid, this is the time of disruption for us. And so I decided to write this book with the idea of trying to tell that story to all of you because I think it creates an important opportunity and challenge for everyone in this room, everyone who's a part of the sector. Now, it's worth thinking for a second about what it means to have an industry disruption. They're different in every sector. The aid industry, if you add it all up, all the organizations in this room, the big ones, the small ones, you add up the US government foreign aid program, the British and the French and the Chinese, it's something like $200 billion a year. Okay, that's about the value of all of the iPhones sold every year, to give you an idea how big it is. It's a pretty big sector. And what's changing about it? Well, historically, this was a kind of monopolistic sector. The technical term for the economists in the room would be a monopsony or an oligopsony. That means just a few people are buying everything. And those few people were just a few of the biggest governments in the world. So we are moving away from that era into an era when there are many buyers of development and humanitarian services or aid. And that includes average people all over the world who with their cell phone can donate $500 million to the earthquake recovery after the Haiti earthquake, or can donate $1 billion through small-scale loans via Kiva, or large-scale billionaire philanthropists, many of them in this city, who are transforming the sector. And so we're now at a moment when we can see in the near term private aid getting bigger than public aid. That's a huge disruption. We're moving to this era of open competition. I like the applauding, but it's good and it's bad. It's good and it's bad. It's got challenges and opportunities. We'll get there. The other big disruption I see is that this was, because it was a government-dominated sector, this was an industry that worked in kind of a wholesale way. So we thought about projects. In fact, my guess is many of you who work in this industry, when you see each other at events like this, you say, hey, what's going on with you? Well, I just got off this one project. I'm about to get on another project. That is the unit of activity in our space. And we're moving from that unit activity to thinking about the individual in need, the person we're actually trying to help. So we're going from wholesale to retail. I think that's a pretty big shift, and I'll give you a couple examples in a moment. And then maybe in some ways the most profound shift is that this has been an industry that's been designed to think of the people we're helping as kind of like victims. And the more modern term we use is beneficiaries. So there's someone who's out there just benefiting from our generosity and our good work. And where we're heading now increasingly, not all the way there, but we're increasingly heading towards seeing the people we're trying to support as actually agents of change in their own lives, as maybe the most important factor in their own lives. and seeing them more like partners or customers. And so the approaches we're increasingly seeing in the aid sector mirror what you might see in many other industries, where you treat even the very poorest people in the world, even in the most difficult circumstances, as the most important person or voice in this equation. And I'll give you a couple examples about this. So here's one. This is a piece of technology that was invented in 1872, okay? The tractor. It's not exactly modern and high tech. But in much of the world, in many of the places where lots of folks in this room go and work, it is a luxury item. Many people simply cannot afford a tractor. And there was a young man, who here has heard of this Hello Tractor organization? A couple of hands, okay. There's a young man named Jahil Oliver, and he was, just like a lot of young people, looking for a career with purpose. But he got an MBA, he worked at an investment bank in Atlanta, and he hadn't quite found it. So he decided, I've got to shake things up, I've got to change something. And he figured out that in Nigeria, there were many, many millions of small-scale farmers who could not afford a tractor. Now, of course, there were others who might have been able to get the money together to buy that tractor, but then it was just sitting there rusting because they had a small field, they couldn't use it every day. And so he said, well, if we can do sharing for cars, if we can do Lyft and Uber, why can't we do Uber for tractors? And he came up with this great idea. Had he come up with this years and years ago, who would he have gone to with this crazy idea? There would have been no one out there to write a check or support him. But because this was just a few years ago, in this moment we're in now, of tremendous disruption, there was not only the technology, but there were the funders and the partners. And so today, just a few years after they've started, now 75% of the new tractors in Nigeria use Hello Tractor. They're in 5 other countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. They're expanding like wildfire. It takes a poor farmer 40 days of back-breaking work to prepare their field for planting by hand. With one of these borrowed tractors, it takes 8 hours. So the key innovation behind something like this isn't GPS. It isn't mobile money. It isn't the tiered funding from USAID and others that got them there, although all those things are really important. The key innovation was seeing the poorest farmer as the customer and as the person who could change their own lives if only their opportunity were unlocked for them. And that's what's happening today by the millions. Here's another example of how aid is changing in this new era of disruption. So I was just in Kenya 2 days ago, and I actually saw this with my own eyes. You know, many of you who've spent time in East Africa have witnessed this. You're driving down the street, and there are these buses that are driving like crazy, these matatu buses. That is the main way people get around. And there's no signaling, there's no indicator. They go wherever they want. And it turns out actually the #1 cause of death for young people in Sub-Saharan Africa is traffic accidents. That's the #1 cause. It's #2 for young kids and the #1 for adolescent kids. And so a couple of researchers said, sure, there's big things we can do to make roads safer, and we all know what those are, and the World Bank and the UN, lots of people are working on these things. We need better roads. We need more cops. We need traffic signals. We need all those things. They're all important. But they said, let's actually go ask the people who are stuck in these circumstances what they might do. Let's talk to the people who are sitting in those buses that are driving out of control. And what they said is, well, we know the driver drives like crazy, but we don't know what to do about it. What are we supposed to do? So they said, what if we put up some stickers in the bus that say Zusha, which in Kiswahili it means speak up or protest? What if we tried to make it socially acceptable using kind of behavioral science approaches that marketers and businesses all over the world use every day? And try to make it socially acceptable to just yell at the bus driver and say, slow down. That's what they did. They put these stickers up. They started with one small randomized controlled trial, and they found a 60% reduction in insurance claims from stickers. They then, based on those results, got a little more funding and a little more funding. They expanded around Kenya. They expanded around East Africa. Now, there's no panacea to an issue this challenging. There's no silver bullet in development. That's a theme I have throughout my book, and I know I don't have to tell everyone in this room that. But in this moment we're in, when we're thinking in very new ways about development, there are just different ways of approaching it. And the return on investment on stickers is pretty huge, and it changes the way we think. So the fundamental underlying trend I see, beyond those 3 big ones that I mentioned, is that we've had poverty. We've had poverty since the beginning of human civilization for 10, 12,000 years. Poverty was the main experience of humanity. When I was born in 1975, it was 4 in 10 people on Earth were living in extreme poverty. In the country where I spent a lot of time as a kid, India, it's still about 1/4 of the country living in extreme poverty. And in the world today, we're getting better. We're down to 1 in 10. That's still 800 million people or so who are living on less than $1.90 a day. So in an era where you pick up the newspaper and the news of the day is manned missions to Mars or autonomous vehicles, or you look around you in a city like Seattle at all the incredible abundance, there's still a reality of dramatic inequality all the way to the point where people simply don't have access to the very basics of food and medicine in much of the world. So that's the reality that we're living in. And in that whole time that we've had all this poverty in human history, we've also had charity. Charity is not a new concept. It's been around since the very early parts of civilization. There are examples back in the Middle Ages. But really, charity has always been designed around the giver. Even the language we use is about us. So on the USAID, we have to, by law, many of the NGOs in this room know this, you've got to put your sticker on that bag of grain or aid that you're providing and it says, from the American people. It's from us. We've got to say who it's from. If you go to the World Bank lobby, it says, our dream is a world free from poverty. It's our dream, right? And I think the really big fundamental shift that's happening today is to say, this is not our dream. This is not about our generosity. This is about the results we're trying to achieve for others. That we're trying to design a new sector, a new aid industry, that is a real competition for good results. And where it doesn't matter what your intention was, that's not good enough just to say, well, I'm a very wealthy person who cares, so I'm writing a check. We actually have to ask the question, what did it do? We have to have some accountability around the results for people. So what I call for fundamentally in this book is this moment of industry disruption. It can be good, it can be bad. Lots of industries are going through this. It's not always good, right? You see thousands of people laid off in some industries. You see real challenges because of disruption. Question for all of us who care about the Sustainable Development Goals, who want to see a better world, is what is the aid industry we want to see? How can we shape this to be the industry that is fit for purpose to achieve the SDGs? What would it look like? And I think this is a great opportunity. This moment is a great opportunity to have that conversation as a community. And I think groups like Global Washington are essential for that. So it's a real honor to get a chance to put my book out there for this purpose, to launch that conversation, to be with all of you. And I'd love to hear your questions or thoughts or comments to continue this conversation. Thank you. And I think we've got some microphones that will go around.
This is one of the quickest keynotes I've ever heard. Succinct. So we have lots of time for questions. Peter, mic to him, please. Peter, stand up so the poor mic people can see you.
Peter Blomquist, what are the 3 most exciting things you've seen in the last 6 months in context of this shift that you're talking about?
Well, everybody heard that question? I just came back a couple days ago from Nairobi. I actually got to visit a small local NGO in Kibera, which is the largest slum in Africa. And it was interesting to me to see to what degree they are utilizing data, not because their donors asked them to, but data because they need it to run their organization. They see the end user as a customer, the people they're trying to support as a customer. And so they're tracking everything, every little piece of data. And to me, that's the kind of exciting thing I'm seeing a lot of. And a couple other big ones are more in the technology space. So one is that we're very quickly heading toward a period of ubiquity of high-speed broadband around the world. And we still, to this day, tend to design our programs for the current technological circumstances, the current connectivity. But I see increasingly organizations saying, we're going to design for just 5 years from now. Not for very long from now, but just 5 years from now. And we know at that point, we're likely to have a very different world ahead of us, where community health workers will have real connectivity in a device. They can do a lot of medical diagnostics. They can send imagery up to the cloud for AI diagnostics of disease. We're heading in this direction very quickly. And I'd say the last one is around biometric identification. There's still a little over 1 billion people in the world that are simply not identified. They don't exist on anyone's books. It happens all the time, in fact, where I just was in Kibera. Babies are born there. Typically, they don't get a birth certificate. That gap is closing really quickly. So that's really exciting. On the flip side, all of these great trends do create challenges. And the big one around biometric ID is Who owns that data? What happens to that data? A lot of it today is sitting on the servers of UN agencies. When people come into a refugee camp, they might get a fingerprint scan or a palm scan. What happens to that data? Is it really secure? Can it fall into the wrong hands? These are often people fleeing from human rights challenges. So I just emphasize that flip side of the coin to say, this is an exciting moment. There's a lot happening, but it does require our attention and conversation and serious and analysis and thought, because if we simply say, well, this is how the aid industry is going and we'll kind of witness it, but not bring our own views about principles and values to the table, we could find this gets away from us very quickly.
Thank you for that point on the values. It reminds me of a book written years ago by John McKnight called The Careless Society, and he was lamenting that we are capable of commodifying everything except care. Do you see a danger in this movement as it relates to how do we keep that element front and center?
I think there is some danger in that, but I think the bigger danger is really that we don't do enough, right? The gaps are so big today that the sense that we should sort of wait on the sidelines and see what happens and be extra careful, I think is the wrong instinct. The instinct today should be the gaps are so big, there are still people dying of the most basic diseases, dying of diarrheal disease, right? That we can dramatically ramp up our efforts in things that we know work, that are proved, that have evidence, and that can dramatically change lives. So I tend to think while we do need to be cautious and have real debate, especially around things like data, privacy, keep human rights at the center of everything we do, the bigger challenge is that, if you take a look at, for example, the wealth inequality in the world, there are a little over 2,000 billionaires in the world today. Together, they hold something like $10 trillion in assets. Only 10% of them have signed the Giving Pledge. So 90% have not signed it. By my analysis, given the scale of their wealth, there is some anonymous donations happening. There's a couple of big institutions that donate anonymously. We tend to know who they are, what they're giving to. Beyond them, the rest of the 90% essentially are not significant philanthropists at any level. So what I would much rather see is people of those levels of means, and really all people, getting into the game. We should cheat on the side of getting in and having real debates about how to do it, what are the right ways to do it, measuring it carefully, having real accountability. But the needs are dramatic. We need to get in the game.
Go ahead, please. Somebody's running right to you.
Hi, could you please expand upon the pros and cons of having the private sector, private donors versus the public institutions, and what you view as both the pros and the cons of that trend?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a very timely question. It's a really challenging area. Look, development, since it started, we've had a real fundamental problem with legitimacy. So even when there wasn't significant private funding, governments in rich countries giving money to governments in poor countries or projects in poor countries to benefit poor people, there's a real problem of legitimacy there. Whose voice matters in this? And as I detail in the book, because of that problem of legitimacy, we've made some really big mistakes. I tell the story about the Haitian rice industry and how in Haiti that was a major employer of farmers. It's the main staple crop of the country. And the U.S., with lots of good intentions, we bought rice from Arkansan rice farmers and shipped it to Haiti and decimated the Haitian rice industry. To this day, it's decimated. So the legitimacy problem, the question of who's really in charge and what are our intentions and are we doing these for the right reasons, these have really always been an issue. Now, you suddenly have a tidal wave of billionaire philanthropy coming into the space, and even small dollar givers, ordinary givers. I tell another story in the book about orphanages and the extent to which there are thousands, really tens of thousands of children effectively kidnapped. And they're kidnapped because orphanages are a good business and because a lot of people with really good intentions here in the US and Australia and Europe want to donate to orphanages. And in Cambodia, for example, even the government estimate is there's something like 5,000 kids today with living parents who are effectively kidnapped, living in orphanages, used for sexual slavery, purposely kept hungry to look emaciated for donor visits, today that's happening, right? So all from very good intentions. So this issue of legitimacy is a big one. Now, it gets bigger when someone comes to the table ready to write a multi-billion-dollar check or announcing a pledge of tens of billions of dollars of wealth. It really does get bigger. And the question, I think, for all of us as an industry is how do we think about that? I would argue we should think in a slightly different way. We should think about UNICEF. UNICEF's a UN organization. Some of you might write a check to it at Christmas time. Think of UNICEF not as something that's owned and run by UN bureaucrats, but it's ours. It's our institution. We fund it. It exists for the public. It's a public trust. We should think in the very same ways about private philanthropies. They exist because there's a legal structure in our government and our system of laws that allows them to exist. They get tax deductions because we vote and agree with policies that get them those tax deductions. So in a sense, even if an individual has done really well in their lives and they've written the check and they've started a foundation, it is a public trust. And that means there has to be a level of transparency and accountability around what they're doing. And I don't think we can shirk our own responsibility as the aid community, as the development community, to say, we're going to hold these groups accountable. We are going to speak up when we see things that are not best practices. When someone is doing something that's whimsical, that might undermine the rights of the poor people that we're trying to help, or that might really be inefficient and not cost effective or disruptive to the work of existing organizations, we ought to speak up about that. It's part of our role at DevX to try to hold groups accountable through our journalism, but I think it's a much broader obligation and responsibility for all of us in the space to see what's happening around us as ours, to see the aid industry as ours. It is a public trust. This is not a lot of private groups doing their own thing and they earn the money so it's theirs, or it's a private company and they've got their own private philanthropy so it's there. This is ours. And we need to see it in those terms if we're going to align it against our own values and achieve the goals that we've all set out to achieve.
James.
Microphone? Oh. Hi, Raj. Sorry about that. Hi, Raj. I'm James Bernard from Resonance. And just want to expand upon that last point you made. I thought you were going to go a different direction with it, with the private sector. But, we work a lot with the private sector in development. And they play a very interesting role in terms of skills development, in terms of off-taking capabilities, in terms of networks and local businesses. And I'm just wondering what your view is of the role of multinational private sector companies who are doing development work because their supply chains and their customer bases are in those places and their growth is going to be in those places. So it's not a top-down USAID-driven initiative, but it's more like a business-driven initiative. I'd love your comments on that.
Great question. So I tell the story in the book. When I was 10 years old, I have an aunt and uncle who were development researchers and scholars. So I was a little kid, one of the rare little kids who really knows what the global development sector is. I'd heard of the World Bank, and they would take me to these village visits. And their main focus was the dairy cooperative movement in India. And so I got to visit this dairy, this milk refiner where they produce milk products, and the smell was horrible. I still remember it really well. And then years later, like 20 years later, I was writing a paper for McKinsey, and I was trying to figure out what are the biggest social enterprises in the world. And I figured in the business sector, we talk about $1 billion is a big business, $1 billion in revenue. So are there any billion-dollar social enterprises? And I looked really hard, and I could only find one in the world. And it was that same dairy cooperative that I had visited as a 10-year-old. It's called Amul Dairy. And Amul Dairy does about $5 billion in annual revenue, all from buying up milk from small-scale women farmers all over India and turning it into cheese and butter and yogurt and ice cream and then selling it around India and around the world. And besides that, I couldn't find any really big ones. Like Grameen Bank is very famous, but I saw they were doing about $300 million in annual revenue. And after that, it got much, much smaller. So what I argue about in the book is there's a real role for social enterprise, sort of pure social enterprises like these, which exist just for a social mission, which were started for that reason. But maybe the bigger opportunity is for the biggest corporations in the world to become social enterprises. And that's not easy. I mean, you've got companies where their core business might kind of be negative for the world, right? So they do a little philanthropy on the side, they try to be corporate citizens, they try to treat their employees well, but maybe their core business really isn't great for the planet. But that's not the case with every business. And I think you can see lots of examples where companies are raising the bar, where they're getting better at what they do. I tell the story of Patagonia in the book, and they do something kind of radical in that they tell their customers to not buy more products. I've seen these messages in their stores, and it's kind of counterintuitive, but they realize we can't be living in a time when we all go out and buy a new pair of clothes every day. We can't be in this sort of fast fashion mentality that we've gotten into. We've got to think very differently about it. And they're saying, we know it might hurt us a little bit in the short run, but if we present this message, people are going to see us differently, and we'll get more customers too. So that kind of thinking, sort of radical corporate thinking, you can see some companies at the forefront of that, but there's huge opportunity. I think we're all drinking Starbucks coffee. Makes sense given where we are. Starbucks to me is a global development company. They're in our sector. Why? Because when we walk into Starbucks, without thinking twice, we see the coffee of the day is from Guatemala or Rwanda. It's from Ethiopia. It's from countries where more than half the population lives in extreme poverty. We don't think twice about that. The people producing the coffee are likely in those circumstances or close to it. And for a company like Starbucks, they have to make sure the producers aren't using child labor, that they've got a sustainable supply of water, that they've got a sustainable, renewable supply of energy, that the coffee is really good quality, it tastes good. They got to think about all those things. So in a way, they're working like an NGO might to make sure that those small-scale farmers are doing well enough to keep their business doing well. And you can find that across many, many corporates, many, many sectors. So I think there's enormous opportunity there. But just like with the philanthropy world, we need to hold companies accountable. We need to have real standards and metrics. We can't sort of just applaud the initiative, the often small initiative. We need to say, what's going on in your core business? And can we measure this against your peers and competitors? And let's hold everybody to really high standards.
Go ahead, Monica.
I'm going to talk about an economist at Oxford, Kate Raworth. Have you come across her book, The Donut Economy? So what she says is that, so my question is going to be about economic growth and the SDG around that. What I learned in reading her book was that our focus on economic growth and measuring GDP has actually gotten into this terrible environmental fix that we're in. We cannot grow our way out of this situation. And she proposes a different measure, the measure of thriving. What if we move our economies to thriving? Not just us, the animals, the biosphere, the whole thing. How can we shift the economic growth argument in development to one of thriving? That's what I would like to ask you.
It's a great question, and I think there are many people who, I think there are many people who feel that exactly as you said, the model we've used to get us into this fix is not going to be the model that gets us out of it. And you can look around the world, rich countries and poor countries, there are people in the streets everywhere, right? There's a sense that we are at a real inflection point between the climate, automation, inequality. This is a moment when something has to give. We need a new way of thinking. And I think the development and aid sector is right at the heart of that we too need to have a new way of thinking about what we do, a new level of urgency. And I do think there are great opportunities to look at the big challenges today and turn them on their heads. And I, in fact, was on stage recently, was here with someone reminding me about it, with Christiana Figueres, who negotiated the Paris Peace Accords, with the LA mayor, and with a young activist from the Marshall Islands, who lives in a country that is possibly not going to exist much longer because of rising sea levels. And we were talking about how grim the situation actually is. Christiana Figueres was talking about we could see New York City be underwater in 10 or 15 years, right? So very dramatic conversation. On the other hand, if we embrace those realities of how serious the challenges are, and we look at all the abundance we have around us, we can reframe this in a way that actually lets us grow, that actually creates new jobs, that actually does create a kind of thriving economy. So I think this is a moment, and that's partly why I wrote this book, is I feel like this is a moment we all need to sit up and say, what are we doing now? We've got to do something a little bit differently in 2019, in 2020, than we were doing 5 years ago or 10 years ago. This has to be a moment of real change for each of us individually and for the organizations that we work in and represent.
Hi, I'm also from Resonance, and thank you so much for your talk. I was hoping to touch a little bit about how we engage individuals in this space and how we really encourage participation outside of the government and the corporations and some of the big, powerful players. But you spoke a little bit just now about some of these movements that we're seeing and really grassroots level participation and demanding more. So what can we do better as a sector to kind of get rid of some of those elitist notions and really develop touch points better within our communities to educate them about what we're doing and educate them about what they can do to further some of our work?
I think there's a lot of ways I could go with that question, but I want to go in the direction of money, okay, for a second. I think the very unsexy area of procurement is a huge opportunity for our sector to actually become far more inclusive. That we are a little bit like the client-server model of the old days. You know, we're very top-down, and we've got this, because of the legacy of government funding, and it's still the majority of funding in our space, we tend to have a strong risk aversion. And so we say, well, we'd love to fund those small local NGOs. We'd love to fund that young person with their great idea, but that doesn't make sense for us. We can only work with major international institutions, and everybody's very careful along the way, and everybody has to take their overhead and their piece of this. And there's got to be a way to say, you know what? This is not a moment to be risk averse. This is a moment to take real risk. And especially with all the private money coming into the space, that's money that can take real risk in the way that government money maybe can't. And so I think a simple metric we could hold ourselves to is how much money are we giving to local organizations, to individuals that are running movements or rights-based groups that are working in communities around the world? How much are indigenous communities getting funding? If we looked at those statistics today, it would be very depressing. We've looked at some of those in some of our reporting at DevX, and the numbers, are not inspirational. So I would say, although there's many things we can do to be supportive, let's look at the way we procure products and services. Let's look at our supply chains. Let's look at the organizations we fund, their scale, and let's start measuring that and holding ourselves to some account around the degree to which we're truly supporting local, indigenous, rights-based groups. We're truly supporting movements. We're supporting young people. Let's look at those figures within our own work, and I think we'll be surprised at what we see. And if we can move the needle there, we can actually be more supportive than we are today.
Who wants to do last question? Okay. So we'll take two. Quick. Go ahead.
My name is Kaz, and my question is more general, though I'll be specific with the question. It's on continuity of what we'd call the positive campaigns, such as the Zusha. I'm from Nairobi, Kenya, very familiar with the Matatu Menace, and I was very happy, among those who were very happy with the Zusha campaign. However, with time, even when I get into the Matatu and I see he's driving like a lunatic, I see the Zusha, but it has become like a decoration. So I'm curious to get your comment about continuity of such positive campaigns.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, that's partly why I refer to the idea there's no silver bullet, because I don't think there is. And many of the things we've seen, I tell the story about Give Directly, which also operates in East Africa and directly provides cash to people who are living in extreme poverty. And they've seen some really good results in the short run, but it's not so clear whether they're sustainable in the long run. And that may be the kind of problem you see around these small individual interventions. All that said, the fact that we're moving in a direction where we measure what we're doing, we measure on a small scale. If it's working, we then add more funding to it, and then we scale it up, and we continue to measure and iterate and change as we go, is a huge innovation over the way we have often worked in the past. And I tell some of those depressing stories too in the book about things like one laptop per child, for example, where we have this really big bang kind of idea, and we invest tens of millions of dollars into it, and we create all kinds of disruption in classrooms and communities around the world, and then it fails 5 years later. And the nice thing about something like Zusha and those kind of campaigns is they're relatively cheap, they're relatively small scale, they're not that disruptive. If they fail, if they stop work, we can try something else. We can iterate, we can pivot, and I think that mentality is an important and big change that we're seeing happen in our sector, and not just on the private side. Zusha was funded as well by US government money that came in with tiered funding along the way as it grew. So there's real opportunity for this kind of innovation in the way we fund to see sustained results over time.
Last question there.
Hi, my name is Jack Hildebrand, and I'm with UNICEF, so thanks for the plug earlier. So my question kind of goes with what's up on the screen, good intentions versus good results. And from the discussion that I was at before lunch on innovation and technology, the word shiny kept coming up. Word
China, you said?
Shiny. like a shiny metal object. And I think that with the problem with the sector, if you're planning a project and you do have good intentions, that you do realize that there's a huge level of competition to get donor funds, and a lot of times what happens is you overpromise or you want to go with these shiny technologies so that you can secure donor funds, because this is really kind of the bread and butter, is using these new technologies, but they might not necessarily have sustainable results. They'll have good results, but not sustainable. And if you're working on agriculture, for example, precision agriculture using drones, it's something, everyone's ears perks up. And it might be easier to get funds for that, but, if you're a farmer, and if you're able to use drones, it'll definitely help with yields, energy savings, water resources, and so on. And if you're able, but you can't get it because even microfinance institutes aren't going to invest in small-scale agriculture because it's too risky with climate change. But if you're able to get that as projects with even UNICEF or other organizations, the CGIAR, you might run into other problems down the road, which is digital literacy, network coverage, and so on. Where on the other hand, you have really simple, not quote-unquote sexy options like alternate wetting and drying, which can reduce methane emissions 60%, saves water, saves energy, saves time, getting water. So my question is, how do we, who are all in the same sector, how do we compete with shiny for things that aren't necessarily sexy, but are more sustainable, they're simpler, but it's not going to get the same kind of attention or donor funds?
Yeah, it's a great and hard problem. I would just say, in our field, I don't know of any example where a funder or the head of an international NGO or any similar organization's executive has been fired for making a bad decision like that, right? Or fired for poor results. So people get fired for all kinds of improprieties, but they don't get fired for bad results for the end consumer, for the poor person you're trying to help, for that farmer. And it's that lack of accountability that's at the heart of problems like this. Because if you work at a foundation and you get excited by a proposal that has all the right buzzwords of blockchain and machine learning and everything else in there and drones, and so you write a check and it fails, then what? Really no accountability around that, for the most part. And so I think the first order problem here is getting more accountability in our sector. And if there's more accountability, then I think you will see a drive toward investing in the things that work. And when there's a lack of accountability, you see whimsical projects. You see personal passions come up. And then you're forced as an organization that's trying to raise money for your good work to sort of go in the direction of the latest fad or the latest trend. So we've got to get to the first order problem here, which is when organizations, when funders are looking to invest in something, are they using best practices around common metrics that everyone can understand? Are there some independent third-party groups that are able to review what they're doing and say whether this is a smart technology approach or whether they're pursuing the things that are considered best practices today? There's a group called GiveWell that I talk about in the book, probably well known to some of you here. Have you heard of GiveWell?
Yep.
They do, it was a couple of young hedge fund analysts from Connecticut. And they were in their 20s, and they were making way more money than anybody in their 20s should make. And they said, we better donate some of this. We know how to invest in companies. There's lots of data and information about which companies to invest in. There's got to be similar data and information about which NGOs to invest in. And they couldn't find it. So I thought, we'll start this ourselves. And that is what has created GiveWell today. And they study every NGO they can, all kinds of initiatives. They study really hard, and they can so far only recommend 8. That's it, 8 in the whole world. And the reason is they're extremely rigorous, and they're looking for the things that they're absolutely going to work. They are problems that are solvable. They're underfunded today. So they have a very rigorous set of criteria that land them at those few initiatives to fund. But a similar rigorous approach to precision agriculture that could be a standard that everybody looks at. And so if some foundation wants to do something really different, they will have to explain why. And they'll have to have their own theory of change. And there'll be some greater sense of transparency and accountability around who's doing what and why they're doing it. I think that's fundamentally what's needed if we're going to get to the right smart investments in technology or in anything else. It's that layer, that idea that in the end we are responsible and accountable to the results, to the people that we're trying to serve around the world. That is the big shift that has to happen in our space to get to the kind of issues you just raised.
Thank you very much. Raj is going to be signing copies of his book at the back, so those of you that are interested in purchasing a book, there's a table right at the back there, and Raj will be sitting there and signing his book. So thank you very much.
And I
But
just
before...
I just want to say a big thank you to all of you, to Akhtar in particular, who has been a friend and supporter of DevX for so many years. We could not do what we do every day without the support of all of you. So thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Once again,
Really.
thank you very much for coming out here and speaking with us. Let me now turn this over to Melissa Merritt, who is going to talk about the next part of our program. Melissa is the Vice Chair of the Global Washington Board.
I was probably supposed to use those stairs, wasn't I? I just leapt up here. Well, hi, everybody. I'm going to try to speak loud so you don't hit your afternoon slump. You've just had lunch, but believe me, when you hear the next speaker, you're going to be on the edge of your seat. And Raj, thank you so much. I think, you know, I've read the book, so if you haven't, I highly recommend it, and really just appreciate the challenge that you've set to us in our sector to really embrace the change that is creating more democratization of philanthropy, as well as a focus on communities. So with that, it's this whole conversation about empowering community is really a good segue into our next speaker and our Global Hero, or should I say Shiro Award for 2019. This is an annual Lifetime Achievement Award, and it recognizes a member of the Global Washington community for their relentless inspiration and actions and influence on social change and on global issues. I think I was trying to scan the room. I know we have one former winner amongst us, which is Akhtar. But people like Bill Gates Sr., Bill Newcomb, Jennifer Potter, my former boss, Tom Waldron, are all winners of this award. And our next speaker is also very deserving. We heard many stories today about the sparks that have led to transformational empowerment. I love the Hello Tractor story. I think some of these things that seem simple, right, just are the ones that lend themselves to such great effectiveness. I love the way Shohini from Breakthrough mentioned in her comments, you know, you need to take the culture that you have and flip it. And that's really a great sort of, I feel like that's at the root of Celeste Mergen's journey. Celeste is the founder and CEO of Days for Girls, and that's a global movement that prepares and distributes sustainable menstrual health solutions for girls who would otherwise miss school during their monthly periods. And yes, here we are talking about menstruation at a conference. That's in part because of the good work of Celeste. She founded the organization 11 years ago after really a stark realization that girls and women around the world were missing school and being ostracized and isolated during their periods. She saw this not only as a global health, public health issue, but also as an issue of access to education, to economic opportunity, and gender equity for women and girls. So her mission has been to turn periods into pathways, to destigmatize and popularize menstrual health awareness, similar to the movement for breast cancer awareness. And it's working. Celeste has figured out a way to scale her work and to be innovative while never losing sight of her customers, the people and the women and girls that she serves. Today, these are some of her statistics for the organization. Days for Girls works in over 140 countries, and has 50,000 local community volunteers who help sew and put together the menstrual hygiene kits and also lead educational programs. Days for Girls has reached 1.5 million women and girls. So I'm blown away by those results. And I think Celeste is also an example of somebody who really exemplifies, I think, what Global Washington is trying to do. She leads and works effectively with other partner organizations so that she can achieve a broader impact. So this isn't Celeste's first award. I'm going to list a few. The list is lengthy, but the Girl Effect Champion, she has received the SEED Award for Gender Equity and Entrepreneurship, AARP's Purpose Prize, the World Economic Forum's Woman of the Decade, and was named by the Huffington Post as a Next 10 organization poised to change the world. And Celeste is also, she's been featured in Forbes and the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and is a sought-after public speaker, so we actually are going to get to hear her speak in a moment. So she's here with her husband and 5 of her 6 children, who she raised in addition to having an assembly of foreign exchange students and foster children while building this organization. So with great humility and a feeling of great pride, I would like to present you with the 2019 Global Washington Shiro Award on behalf of the Board of Directors. Come on up.
One of those moments when you wonder who they're talking about. What an amazing thing. Thank you. This award, this is both, be emotional, I don't want to be emotional, is both extraordinary and important. Extraordinary because of the room we're in. Extraordinary because of the people who won it before. Important because it turns out that something as simple as periods are pivotal to families, to girls, to communities, and to a shift in equity. Incredible because when Days for Girls started 11 years ago, everybody said nobody's going to talk about periods. And here we are. I'm so grateful to be with you, thankful to Global Washington for convening this wonderful event, for the opportunities to connect and to practice and speak of best practices. Thankful to my family, some of which are here, and for all they sacrificed so I can do this. I just love you so much. Thank you for being so generous. And to my amazing husband, Don, who often says, I know that all of your days are for girls, but could I have a few Mergens moments? Extraordinary all. When Days for Girls started, I was doing development, thinking of water and thinking of agriculture, thinking of ways that their community could have greater access to education. And it had never occurred to me even once to ask what girls were doing for menstruation. Then one evening late, I was pondering on what to do for an orphanage in school. Uh-oh, it's an orphanage. And to help them have more food. And then woke at 2:30 in the morning with it going through my head, have you asked what the girls are doing for feminine hygiene? I ran to the computer. I gasped, literally, and emailed, not expecting an immediate answer. I got an immediate answer, and it was only this: nothing, they wait in their rooms. These rooms were 50 girls in a room, sitting in a corrugated room that had bunk beds end to end and side to side, 2 or 3 girls on a bunk. 50 girls in a room, how do you possibly wait in a room? It turned out they would sit on a piece of found cardboard for days. This is the moment I knew we had to do something to help them get out of the room. So I wish I could say I thought of something innovative and wonderful. My thought was the only thing I knew, disposable single-use pads. What I hadn't thought of was there was no place to dispose of anything. So the pit latrines, when I arrived 3.5 weeks later, were filled and stopped and no longer usable and having to be shoveled out. What I did think of is that if I sent resources for pads, if I could even fund every month what 500 girls needed, $200 a month for those 500, and they needed food or other things, they would spend it purposefully and needfully for those things. So how do you make sure they have what they needed month after month? So we made the first washable pad, and it was a truly awful design. And I can say that because I designed it. They were white because pads are white. Raise your hand if you would put a Menzies stain thing in your front yard to dry. Anybody? Hadn't thought of that. They look like a pad because they were a pad. And then I knew enough to listen. Even from the very first time we came and we talked with them about what a period is and their health and that they matter and that they could stand up for themselves. I was instructed not to tell you, but I'm going to tell you anyway. I want to show you what one of the Kenyan women, because always we had local people join us in all aspects of this. She came up and I didn't know what she was going to say, and her job was to talk about protecting yourself, standing up for yourself. In her blue Kenyan outfit, this is all she said. If a boy bother you, I tell you what to do, you tell him zip it. I said just zip it. Thank you. She walked to the side, and we continued to have this wonderful conversation. The girls received their kits, and the first set to come out the door hugging them said, "Thank you so much, because before you came, we had to let them use us if we wanted to leave the room and go to class." I'm hoping that didn't mean what I feared it meant, but it turned out that they were being sexually exploited in exchange for a single disposable pad. And that was the moment Days for Girls was born. We continued to listen about the design. 28 versions later, having learned from every single version of the pad, it is flexible to their needs, washes with little water, it dries quickly, it is culturally, physically, and environmentally relevant, because their wisdom is what mattered in the driving of this design. And that's so powerful, it was worthy of a patent, which we have on this pad today. Not for us, but because we want to protect the entrepreneurs who are bringing it to their own communities. Entrepreneurs like Ellis. Ellis is from Kenya, and when she was first having her period, remembers it very well, because her teacher slapped her when she refused to stand. It was the first time she'd ever had a period, and she could see the stain that was growing. She got up later, turned her skirt around, put her books around them, and left. And she determined she didn't care how many times she was slapped, she would risk it. She would risk being ashamed. She would risk being laughed at. And again, she did just that until she graduated. Today, she's a young ambassador of women's health in Kenya. She runs and is the leader of an enterprise there. Her enterprise employs people and gives them dignity and hope and the voice of leadership there. And today, in just 1 year, they've reached more than 6,200 girls there. She says, "I'm just happy to see them know that menstruation is a sign of being a healthy woman." She's not alone. Thank you. She's not alone. We have Maya, the country director in Days for Girls Nepal, and she would tell you about chapati. Do you know about this? The tradition that you're untouchable, that you should stay out in a shed when you're menstruating. And she and the other leaders of Days for Girls Nepal have gone into villages far and wide in places you can't take a vehicle. And in just 1.5 years had reached more than 14,000 women and girls. And with knowledge and dialogue and community buy-in are freeing women from the sheds. In several communities, they have begun to tear down those isolating, dangerous sheds with their own 2 hands. This is the power of giving it to someone else, but they're not alone either. We have Karia. She is from Lebanon. She employs at her Days for Girls enterprise Syrian refugees, as well as reaching refugees. And they've learned there that though some are given disposable single-use pads, that there's no place to throw them away there either. And culturally for them, this is akin to being ungodly. Unclean is not just embarrassing. To throw a pad outside is not just a social faux pas, it is deeply shaming. For them, something they could count on month after month was vital. She has reached more than 7,000 women there. And she's not alone. There's Anita. Anita is in Kenya. I got a call from her just 9.5 weeks ago, and she explained that a girl, she'd just gotten a call from a school, had traveled there to comfort the community and the teachers and students because a girl had just committed suicide, having been shamed for her period in class. She left as instructed to clean herself up to get water out of the river in the very rope she should have lowered that can with. Sorry. She instead hung herself with. I couldn't be there that day. You couldn't be there that day. Anita could. This is her community. She went to their side and gave them education and hope and resources, and they're rallying together to break the stigma and shame. It's way more powerful to put solutions into the hands of those we serve with. We've seen that evidence in Cambodia. In Cambodia, Moni is working with the Ministry of Education, and there they're putting Days for Girls curriculum into the education of the entire country. That happened not because of me, not because of someone in our program, but because Moni wanted it and the government of Cambodia asked for it, and we're just responding. That kind of advocacy is part of our theory of change and a big part of our future, and all of it is simply amazing. Remember Ellis that I told you about first? Today, Ellis, or 3 days ago, Ellis was in front of an international convening where she got to advocate for menstruation, where she got to speak about education mattering so much, where she got to use her voice. And today, people in her community like Grace can go to school, be comfortable, be confident, play sports. And before, she wouldn't have been able to, because we're all afraid to talk about periods. Thank you for being among those who are not. Thank you for being the miracle that says, I know, let's have her come talk here. Thank you for recognizing that sometimes big shifts are in the hands of small things. And in fact, this is one of the keys to global equity. We're seeing that. It's scaling. And it's scaling it. It's not the easy way. This way that we're doing it is not the easy way. But it sure is working. Thank you for acknowledging this, because there are a lot of things that are hard to change in this world right now. But this is not one of them. This is something we can change in our lifetime, this generation, right now. It just takes appropriate solutions, scale, and partnership. Join us. We can already see a day when we will have reached every girl, everywhere, period. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you so much, Celeste. So Celeste has been recognized and honored by Oprah, by Meghan Markle, I believe. She's going to Iceland tomorrow to receive another award. She is our own hometown Shiro. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you all got to hear her story, because again, Washington State is so unique that we have so many fantastic people here doing this work. So, without further ado, we're going to move along with our program. The next part of our program is that you all have breakout sessions again, and then we'll end again in plenary where we started this morning. I hope today's going well for you. The very last thing I'm going to do before you leave is I really do want to recognize my planning committee that's been helping me for the past 6 months to put this together, my amazing staff, especially Andy Lawn, Pratima Stanton, Donnie Wayno, Cara Bayer, if they're still here, and all the volunteers that are here, and my board members and host committee. So please give them a round of applause. Thank you. Okay, so please remember you can buy Raj's book, and he'll be back there to do some signatures, and then make your way to your next session. Thank you so much.